of education typically tends to be themed around schools and teachers. So someone may ask, why on earth are we out here talking about tutoring? Well, that someone has clearly not been paying much attention to education policy or practice for the last 2 years. In-school tutoring is an absolutely central part of the education zeitgeist. The National Tutoring Programme is the flagship of the Department for Education's post-COVID recovery policies. A recent report by the Sutton Trust indicates that tutoring is now the most common spending priority for secondary school leaders when it comes to supporting their pupil premium students. And a recent poll by Parentkind found that 76% of parents support targeted in-school tutoring for their child if they fall behind in English or maths. In this context of boom times for in-school tutoring, we, the Centre for Education and Youth, with the support of Third Space Learning, Action Tutoring and White Rose Maths, began investigating how government policy can ensure that this vast groundswell of in-school tutoring can be made more sustainable, more impactful and better able to reach disadvantaged students. Our findings and recommendations are captured in our recently published report, Levelling Up Tutoring, How Can Tutors Contribute to Closing England's Attainment Gap in Schools by 2030. In this report, we begin from the premise that a uniquely robust evidence base shows that tutoring is an especially powerful intervention for improving academic progress for young people. Now, typically, this power of tutoring is leveraged by wealthy families through private tutoring to improve the academic outcomes of their children. And research shows that this is one of the main drivers of the general attainment gap between advantaged and disadvantaged children. However, if disadvantaged children can be given greater access to tutoring, then perhaps we could see that general attainment gap start to close. Now, in some respects, this narrowing of the attainment gap was one of the ambitions of the National Tutoring Programme. The NTP was set up to remediate learning loss that had been caused by COVID, with it being well established that young people from disadvantaged backgrounds have experienced more of this loss. The NTP was thus aimed at narrowing the attainment gap that widened over COVID. However, as 2 years of press can attest, the NTP has been beset by challenges in uptake and impact, and is arguably some way away from achieving this goal of narrowing the COVID attainment gap. Our report set out to understand how the NTP can be modified, improved, and extended to realise this ambition of closing the COVID attainment gap. Indeed, we go further and look at how education policy in the long term can support in-school tutoring to contribute to closing the general attainment gap between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged young people. To understand how to deliver this ambitious aim, we gathered insights from those at the front line of delivering in-school tutoring. We surveyed over 180 school and trust leaders from across the country to understand their experiences of and attitudes towards the NTP and how it can be improved. We also interviewed tuition providers, policymakers at the DfE, and a wide range of experts to develop a richer understanding of what policies need to be in place to support high quality and accessible in-school tutoring for disadvantaged pupils. The outcome of this research are recommendations you see behind me on this screen. We argue for 3 phases of levelling up in-school tutoring. An improved phase, where immediate, relatively tractable modifications are made to the NTP. An embed phase, where more ambitious developments to the NTP are made to improve the quality of in-school tutoring and its uptake at scale. And a transform phase, where a sustainable source of high-quality tutors is established for all disadvantaged young people to access. Now, our report and recommendations have been developed in close conversation with the wider sector. However, there is still much to discuss about our findings, our recommendations, and indeed, the wider context of in-school tutoring. So, we've assembled a panel today to have precisely that conversation, all centred around the provocation, are tutors the solution to the achievement gap? I'm personally really excited to hear this discussion with a fantastic panel representing voices from across the education landscape. After that conversation, I'm going to close with 5 minutes of concluding thoughts, primarily in response to the discussion. We'll have some time for Q&A, and although the session finishes at 12, we're going to have 15 minutes at the very end where people can stay in the space, have a little mingle, come and talk to us, all accompanied by some cake that's already been cut out. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mary Myatt, chair of our panel, to start this discussion on are tutors the solution to the achievement gap.
Lovely, thank you, Baz, and welcome all. Delighted to chair indeed this panel. I'm the chair of the board for the Centre for Education and Youth. I'm an education advisor, writer and speaker, and I'm delighted to have on this panel 4 brilliant people with great insights on this. I'm going to invite each of them to introduce themselves and to answer the question, whether tutors are the solution to the achievement gap. Just a brief observation, then we're going to open it up to more questions. So, Tom, first of all, I'd like you to introduce yourself.
Hello everyone, my name is Tom Cooper. I founded a business called First Best Learning 10 years ago, and we recruit and train specialist maths tutors in Asia in order to provide affordable online tutoring to children in schools across the country. We've delivered around 1.5 million hours of teaching to children in about 4,000 primary schools across England. 55% of those children are eligible for pupil Freedman, so we've got good experience in exactly what the NTP is aiming to solve. I don't think tutoring is the solution. I think it's an important part of the mix. There are some much bigger factors at play in solving that attainment gap, but it's good to see the government putting money into tutoring. It can play an important part. If I look at the report, the two bits that came out for me in particular, first is less exciting, arguably, it's one we live, so Suzanne and I lived and breathed, which is the lack of consistency. I'm sure Ian will talk about this as well. It is impossible, nearly impossible, for schools and providers to deliver effective tuition at scale if everything changes all of the time. It is a no. A total no, and it's getting simpler, but I fear that it will only be by the end of the 4 years that actually that will be fully grasped by the Department of Education. The second part, which I think is the more radical proposition at the end, is about paid tutoring, which I think can be incredibly exciting, both for the tutor and the tutee within that dynamic. If something like that could be pulled off at a national level, I think that could be incredibly helpful. So that is my long-term thought. My short-term hope is the simplicity and criteria that the report advocates.
Thank you, Tom. Susanna.
Hi everyone, my name is Susanna and I'm the founder and chief executive of Action Tutoring. We're an educational charity, and like Tom, we started around 10 years ago with an ambition of making the benefits of tutoring more widely available to those that wouldn't otherwise afford it. So we did on the NTP, and I really hope, however, the NTP evolves, that we'll be here running into the future too. And I would completely agree with Tom that tutors cannot be the sole solution to solving the attainment gap, but they are a really important part of it. And I think over the last decade or more, we've only seen private tutoring continuing to increase, and therefore the potential that has to only exacerbate the attainment gap, I believe, is very real. And I think because of that influence of the private tutoring industry, the focus of the report brings out on equitability and making sure that the NTP is focused on those that really need it the most is really important. And I think over the last year we've seen that sort of slip in the government's ambitions, particularly with the removal of the 65% pupil premium target. Now I know there are all sorts of reasons why pupils might be eligible for the programme who are not pupil premium, because it's not an exact science. But without some form of measure and awareness of who is the NTP being targeted at, I actually think there's a real danger it can stand to widen the attainment gap if we're not careful with it, which will surely be a complete travesty of what it was ever setting out to achieve. So tutors can be a big part of solving that gap, but only if collectively we make sure it's focused on those right pupils. I think the other factor the report draws out that is so critical in all of this is that you cannot just chuck tutors into a school or set up some form of in-house schools-led tutoring and just expect the magic to work. Yes, there is great evidence around the benefits tutoring can bring, but how this is implemented and how that's structured, of course, will make all the difference. And that's something we've been really passionate about as an organisation, trying to understand the impact of the practice can have online, face-to-face, some of the very real logistics around what time of the day we offer sessions. We've seen the DMP swing from ratios of 1 to 3 to 1 to 6, which surely needs to have an impact on what's happening. And I thought we need to understand a lot more from evidence about what actually goes on in those tutoring relationships and set up. That will make this have the difference. We can't just assume that throwing tutors in will be the solution. The final point, of course, is funding. We've seen so many pressures on schools this year, particularly rising cost of supply, teachers, gas bills, frequent school meals. All of those factors going on are incredibly real, and I do believe that there's not enough funding for all of this, and if the NTP is going to stand a chance of leaving a legacy in the system post-COVID that's not just related to this immediate time that we're in, then it's not going to be serving on funding from the schools.
Thank you, Susanna. Ian.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you for having me today. So my name is Ian Taylor. I am the head of school performance at a multi-academy trust called Academies Enterprise Trust. We have 57 schools across the country, 5 special schools, 21 secondary schools and 31 special schools, primary schools. We've had 11,000 of our pupils this year work through NCP tuition. And to the question about is tutoring the answer, I think it's part of the answer. One of our schools I was working with this week, called Leafy Forest in Birmingham, got 75% pupil premium and just achieved 90% in phonics. So when you diagnose the challenges they have with pupil premium, one, it's attendance, two, it's well-being, three, it's character, access to vocabulary reading, but also something that I think we don't talk about enough is the real precision of special education needs. You know, the hidden special education need of SLNC. And people talk about communication as an expressive challenge, but a real hidden need is receptive communication and the ability to hear and access what the teachers tell pupils. And you don't see that with a year 5 child or a 7-year-old child, so that's a real challenge. So we feel we need to be really precise with what tuition can help with, and we think it's probably 3. One is really, really precise support of pupils' gaps. You know, those tiny components of a learning objective rather than a larger learning objective. The second would be misconceptions. You've got more time in tutoring to really pinpoint the misconceptions of the pupils. And the third, and the biggest one, is just curriculum time. You know, when you think about pupils having 1 hour of tuition every single week for their school lives, which happens for more privileged pupils in some cases, that's 200 hours, which is equivalent to a year. So tutoring helps us gain more curriculum time, but not as a result of replacing classroom lessons. It's got to be in addition, in our opinion.
Yeah, thank you. And Sam?
Morning everybody. I don't know how to describe myself anymore. I think I'm a professional tutor basically. But I used to be an advisor at the DFE, I still do lots of policy work as well. So, I mean, a lot of it's already been said. You know, obviously it can't be a solution by itself, it can be part of the solution. There's an extremely strong, probably the single intervention with the strongest evidence base for effectiveness that there is. So certainly important to do if you get it right. And if it didn't work, I'm really wasting my money getting them for my own kids. So I hope it works. And I think that's the point, right? Like I get a tutor for my kids because I can afford to do that in maths. So if we don't provide tutoring within the education system to those whose parents can't afford to do it, then of course you're going to widen the gap, but as a function of that. So I really support the point around quality and the focus on quality, and I am worried that we're going to sort of lost that sort of string of what makes us important. It has to be pretty heavily targeted if this is going to change the achievement gap, and it's going to add real value to the system. But I mean, let's be honest, it's been a monumental shambles in some cases. It's been embarrassingly and frustratingly bad because they messed up their procurement. The Department for Education messed up their procurement. Everybody told them they were messing up their procurement, and they went ahead and did it anyway. And then less than a year later, they had to undo it, and we lost a huge chunk of time at a really crucial moment when there was public support and there was support within the highest levels of government for doing something about COVID recovery. We lost a moment because of that. So I'm extremely annoyed about it, but I think let's try at least. I'm not hugely optimistic about the next round of procurement either, but let's hope it works better, and let's hope that the recommendations in this report, which are all very good, are taken forward as part of what, because this programme could be incredibly valuable, which is why it's so annoying.
Thank you, Sam.
Sorry if I sound a bit grumpy. It doesn't actually have any they messed up. So
I'm going to ask some follow-up questions for the panel to answer in more detail, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. Sam, I'd like to ask you to expand a bit on this. So, first of all, questions about how hard can it be to get procurement right? Do they have specialists helping them?
That's the problem. The specialists are the problem. They have there's a commercial team in the Department for Education, and there was been certainly since I was there, and they run the procurement exercises. And over time, that team has become much more powerful than the policy teams, and that is the problem. It is not being driven by the policy team, it's being driven by the commercial team, and the commercial team has the wrong set of objectives. And they do not know what they're looking at, and over again they are messing up procurements, and it is a massive, massive issue. Because it's boring and the word procurement immediately sends everyone to sleep, it doesn't get the attention it should do. But it's not just the Department of Education, it's across government. It is. We saw it with test and trace during COVID. It is a real problem with the government operates, that these commercial teams and departments are dominating decision making around what should be policy driven choices. And ministers are too scared to get involved because they don't want to be accused of favouring preferred provider or anything like that, and they're told they're going to be challenges. So they don't actually, for all I've been rude about Gavin Williamson in the past, he wanted to overturn the decision and he wasn't allowed to. So it's a bizarre situation to get to where you've got elected ministers knowing that something that is about to be done is wrong, but not being able to overrule the decision being taken by the commercial team. So the problem is that these teams have become too powerful, don't have policy specialism, and don't know what they're doing, and that's where you keep getting these terrible decisions.
And it's part of that because they're looking at those costs.
It's partly because they're looking at cost, and for this particular procurement and I think actually for most of the ones they're doing, they made too much of it cost related, which didn't allow them, because then the moment Randstad got over the quality bar, which they squeaked over by I think half a point, the fact that they had then come in at such a lower level of cost meant that they kind of had to win. But then they hadn't had enough money, and that's one of the reasons why they weren't able to provide the service. So it was a badly designed procurement. The policy teams weren't properly involved, and the ministers weren't allowed to agree.
To give some kind of feeling on the experience end of that, there was no market engagement pre-procurement. So for schools and providers, there was zero conversation. And so then this comes out, and it kind of locks in these mistakes of not engaging with people actually know what it is to be traditional to implement it in a school. And we the conversations I had where we speak to policy teams, we say we can't do anything about without commercial. So they absolutely will be loose in terms of what decisions could or more importantly could not be made.
So thank you for that. And so to open it up to anyone on the panel developing that, the balance, trying to get the balance right between top-down quality control from central government and bottom-up ease of distribution. So what do you think are the best ways of managing this tension moving forward so the government can improve access to high quality tutors? Probably you want to kick off with that?
Yes, I do. So in principle, I favour the market-led approach when schools decide. And so if I look at the two pillars that we've experienced, the tutor partner pillar, where it's very prescribed in a school-led grant, which gives the money to schools, I favour the school-led grant. And I think some of the experience we've had the last 2 years, the vast majority of people do that. The concern I have with that, and we've seen it at the moment, is that or we think we're seeing it, that funding gets kind of subsumed into core funding, and it doesn't actually make its way into what it's supposed to, which is tutoring close to the family.
Is it not ring-fenced?
Money goes into the school's account. There is very lightweight reporting. It's ring-fenced in a similar way to people thinking it's ring-fenced. So yes, it is if you're at the DFE, you think it's ring-fenced. How that actually gets spent is a different thing. Particularly if you're a teacher who's got an incredibly challenging project to balance.
I had a real concern on this when the 1-to-6 ratio came out. I think that was back in March, quite some drastic shift from 1-to-3 to 1-to-6 with very little evidence behind it. But 1-to-6 under schools and their tutoring, I think, starts to look remarkably like what probably a lot of TAs do. And very easy for schools, and I really don't blame schools at all for doing this, to put money that they would have been spending anyway on TAs and put it against the tutoring fund. They wouldn't have got them. It's not actually something additional happening in the school, but just moving money to pay for something that would happen. As I say, don't know the schools at all for that, but how we make sure that NTP funding actually stays as something additional for pupils rather than something that would have likely been happening anyway, I think is really important.
Well, just a bit more flexibility in budget. I think there's flexibility in premium recovery budget, but the school-led grants actually been quite strict. On the 31st of August, we have to justify to DfE the exact number of hours and the exact number of pupils and the costs. So I think that's tighter and enforcing schools in a good way to reinforce tuition. I think around the balancing area that you asked around the QA of this and top down this and what's not. I think if it is top down, so if it's kind of national providers that are delivering online tuition or face-to-face tuition, I think the QA has to be super tight. But I think we need to use technology to come up with a really interesting way for us as users and teachers to be able to judge providers. So we have an open source system where teachers and school leaders can see what other teachers have said about those providers. But Atulka Wandi says when you've got a complex problem, move it local. And I think we've got to trust schools more. You know, I represent 57 schools and we know our schools better than providers do. We know our kids better than DfE does. So when we get told to spend money in such a precise way or to use certain providers, trust us to choose providers ourselves. Trust us to find local tutors and local experts ourselves. And that's what we've done as an organisation. Our schools have found local tutors, local experts, and quality assure them ourselves. So I think the quality assurance has to come from two sides. Open source, if it's national providers, and trust schools if it's local.
I think actually this goes to a much wider problem with the design of our education system at the moment. We're saying, should it be central government or should it be schools? As if those are the only choices. Of course they are the only choices in the way we've got the system set up at the moment. But it would be mad to say about, we're going to introduce a major health initiative. It has to be either the Department of Health or individual hospital trusts. We don't have an NHS to do that. There's no delivery mechanism in the education system anymore. Whether at local authority level or at national level, through sort of executive agencies, it's all gone. So you're getting the DfE being dragged into delivery, which it's not good at and isn't designed for, and schools having to do things that they're not really able to do either. I think trust is slightly different to big trust, but you've still got a lot of very small trusts or individual schools. So neither really have the capability or capacity to deliver a program. So you need another organisation that doesn't exist at the moment, or a completely rebuilt local infrastructure that can do programs. Otherwise, it's not a lever the DfE can pull really at the moment. That's why I've struggled so much with this program. And struggled so much throughout COVID with all of the different things they do. Because they're trying to deliver everything to a system that isn't designed to deliver this.
Can I just support that? So, Sam, I completely agree with that because we are lucky that we're a group of 57. We're a family of 57 schools, so we have colleagues who work centrally who can support. If you're an individual school, particularly a small primary school, and the head teacher does everything in that school, it's really difficult to allocate that funding, to find the providers, QA, to manage logistics. It's super tough to do that, and more help is needed.
So, just to pick up on your point, Sam, that kind of middle space to make this happen in a realistic way, would that have been a role for local authorities when they were functioning?
I mean, you could either do these things through local authorities, which certainly would have been what would have happened 20 years ago, or you could do it through national delivery infrastructure, which is what happened in the health system, and towards the end of the New Labour period, you had sort of organisations like TBA and National College for School Leadership who were able to deliver programs. But you haven't got either of those at the moment. You've got to have one, at least, of those two things. Otherwise you have no delivery mechanism for anything, not just tutoring, but anything you want to do. And you're left only being able to use accountability and funding as tools, as levers, which are crude levers. And we've seen overuse in the last decade, but there's nothing else you can use. So I think it's either local or central, but you've got to pick something.
Yeah, thank you. Susanna and Tom, I'd just like to turn to you in terms of variability across the country in terms of access to high quality tutors. Making that as a statement, as a claim, do you recognise that? And if so, what do you see as needing to be done to fix it? Is that the case?
Yes, I think that's definitely been the case. One of the things I think was an error made by the DfE this year was to put out that schools should go for face-to-face tutoring if they could. And I think that put quite a lot of attempting online tutoring or being a bit more open to at least experimenting with that. But I know many providers, ourselves included, have seen some really fantastic results from online tutoring, and once schools kind of get into it, actually they're very happy with it and coming back for more and asking to go back to face-to-face. So not saying one is at the exclusion of the other. I believe the DfE have now shifted the guidance on that, because certainly online tutoring can be a massive part of the answer of how to get to areas that are harder to recruit and quality face-to-face tutors that we need. I think Tom and I represent quite interesting organisations in this space that we don't sort of recruit from the traditional markets of tutors. Actually, tutoring we use volunteers, and that means we attract a lot of retired, those that would never have an interest in tutoring. We also work with a lot of corporates and get them tutoring as part of their CSR packages. And we're able to do that because we have a very structured programme with curriculum and staff support in place that makes it possible to assure quality. And as you heard from Tom, they use tutors from abroad. So I think we can think more broadly about who makes for a good tutor. Uni students are part of it, but they're not the only part. Likewise, ex-teachers are obvious form, but we can think more broadly about who can use the tutors, how we can get them involved, and online just has the potential to push you. Certainly for busy corporates, the idea of an hour from their desk is very doable in a way that travelling to a school might not be in this vision of untapped potential there. And we're all desperate to do meaningful CSR initiatives.
Yeah, big potential to spread that. Tom, is there anything you'd like to add?
It is hard enough to match supply and demand if you're talking about full-time teachers. So when you start talking about people coming into schools a day a week to do a couple of hours tutoring in areas that have less supply, perhaps more rural, of course it's going to be incredibly difficult. And so it's no surprise that online plays a huge part in filling that gap. We over-index in every education investment area across the country, which we think is not surprising because of the online delivery model that we have. And what we'll talk about, as Suzanne said, that if you want to actually try and solve that attainment gap, the volume of children you need to work with, you have to bring new supply, such as volunteers, such as the tutors we recruit and train in Asia. It's impossible to actually scale to that size at 2 million children eligible for pupil premium. How are you going to actually help that volume of children every year when already you can't get enough teachers into the classroom? So we need more teachers in the classroom, better paid, better supported. So if you're going to deliver tuition in addition to that, of course you need more studies and more studies. This is just a part of the picture, but we need more of that, and it requires long-term planning if you're actually going to have the impact that the NTP is aimed at. From a tutoring point of view, we've been doing for the last decade.
I think there's huge potential as well to strengthen the link between tutoring and teaching, whether that's tutors going into teaching or teachers wanting out the classroom but staying in tutoring, and actually ultimately to raise this credibility of tutoring as a profession.
This was something that I think the EF did very well. So yes, there was a big tutoring sector in the UK, but it was aimed at tending to middle-class families at home. Obviously, very, very different from school, the complexity of the classroom, the setup, the onboarding, the processes that come with that. And there's actually very few organisations in the country 2 years ago that had any experience of actually how to work with the complexities of the school. So to go from, well, not quite zero, but very little to hundreds of thousands of children a year, up and then down and chop and change, is very challenging. So the government has to commit for a far longer term than 4 years and give that consistency if we're going to actually build a sector that can work with schools to solve this problem.
And no one says that point. So Tom, I think that's crucial because for some schools that I've been looking at to interact with that are not part of the trust, it almost feels like, in some cases, a chore. What I mean by that is the workload to lead the management is so tough for some small schools. But I think I'm just going to do what I need to do this year to meet the criteria. But if it's part of a long-term plan, it can become part of the school's strategic approach, and that school can then plan for the future, rather than thinking, this is almost a tick box for this year or the next 18 months.
my school. Yeah.
So Ian, I'm just going to wrap up this session before I hand over to Baz to summarise. In terms of your role within the Multi-Academy Trust, could you just identify one aspect, savvy way of making this work from your point of view, leading on this?
Well, it's hard to answer that, Mary, without talking about being part of a wider network.
Yeah.
The best thing for us is being able to create a network of tutoring leaders in schools to share successful practice in terms of how do you increase attendance for pupils, how do you logistically manage it, and how do you quality assure the process. So I would say developing networks of local schools.
That's really helpful, thank you. Thank you for keeping your time. So, Baz, over to you for summarising this and then we'll have questions from the floor.
Thanks, Mary. Well, I must have a bit of a death wish hoping to summarise and follow such an esteemed and fascinating panel, but I'll do my best and I'll try to keep it quick. I'd love to get some questions from the audience. I think a really key theme for me that's come out of this discussion has been something that's actually one of our design principles for this report. You might be able to see the very top left. Sorry, well, say of this screen, which is scaffolded autonomy. I think there's a very strong sense that schools are, in many respects, very, very well positioned to make individual procurement decisions on what tutors they want to bring in and how they want to go about doing that. But this isn't something that they can do by themselves. This is a very key theme running through a lot of the Centre for Education and Youth work, the idea that schools can't do this by themselves. And the tutoring world it's a dappled world. It's a very, very wide range of different types of tutoring services that draw on very different corners of the workforce, that deliver tutoring through lots of different modes. And that's actually, while that might make it a challenge from a regulatory perspective, it's actually one of its virtues because it means that it can meet a lot of different types of need. And schools obviously vary a lot, so have lots of different types of need. So we want to preserve that virtue that the tutoring market has while empowering schools with the autonomy to access that as they need. Another really key theme for me is this idea that short-termism is not going to get anyone anywhere here, and this needs to be something that we think of as being a long-term feature of our educational system. So part of that scaffolding, from my perspective, and I think from the panel's perspective, is supporting schools to build long-term partnerships with organisations outside themselves that will allow them to access tutors as part of their own long-term strategies. That has all sorts of kind of benefits to it in terms of allowing tutors to align with the curriculum of the school, to become familiar with systems within a school, ensure that there's that ready accessibility for young people in that school to tutor when they need it. And to pick up on a theme that emerged in the last session that we did, which was all about young people on the margins, the Centre for Education and Youth book that was published last year. There's a very strong sense in which a lot of disadvantaged young people, at some point during their school career, have to access one-to-one personal attention, whether that's through tutoring, whether that's through mentoring. And at the moment, this happens in quite an unstructured, ad hoc kind of way, in a way that's quite reactive. But I think a key thing that's come out of this discussion is that we need to be more proactive about that and build this as a long-term feature of schools' strategies. And having those partnerships with external providers could be a really key way to do that. So those are my key takeaways from the session. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I'm going to hand over to Mary to share our Q&A, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about this question.
Thank you, Baz. So to open it to the floor for any questions from the panel, thank you, Myatt.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on Tom's point about getting more supply of tutors from actually existing people. I'm a teacher, I look after kind of working independently, working in both sectors. Look after partnerships between schools, and we've been working over the last few years, especially chatted to Ian during the pandemic. We've got a need to peer sort of learning app. I'm just wondering whether the other panelists see that as a source of sort of supply of potentially excellent tutors or mentor students that recently done those exams.
Great, and we'll like to
Do you mean those who've gone on to uni?
No, especially for example, year 12s helping year 10s and 11s, year 10s potentially helping year 8s and 9s.
We've had some attempts at it,
Yeah.
but it requires very careful management to train those who are going to do the tutoring and then safeguarding around it and so on. So I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's a bit more time consuming and just needs that sort of extra close eye on it. But I think we work has worked for us and can be hugely beneficial both ways. When the NTP guidance came out, tutors had to be a team. So there was a very clear message that wasn't allowed. I think you also just need to think about year groups and how that sort of level gets matched. For us at work, that's when we try to do sixth formers but the supervision needs to be really tight.
I think it would have to be a very local thing, within the school or a local community of schools. And I definitely echo Suzanne's point that it's a two-way benefit. So the skill set being able to explain, articulate, and help someone else is incredibly valuable. So for both parties, I think. I have no idea how it would work, but I think like, in terms of supply and mutual benefit, I think it could be incredible.
We're trying to do something radically different, aren't we? We're trying to expose more pupils that wouldn't usually receive tutoring to receive tutoring. So we're trying to do something radically different, but our strategy isn't radically different. So we're trying to achieve something without the ability to achieve it. So we need to be radically different about how do we appoint tutors. I think Tom's point is absolutely right. Third space, vetting and training their tutors, their surrounding teachers is fantastic, so you can trust those teachers, those tutors. So that's one way of doing it. How do we tap into our teaching market? The other is how do we tap into current teachers? So teachers that teach all day and actually might want to teach tuition after school. How do we tap into training teachers? So almost make it compulsory as a training teacher to do some form of tuition per week. And how do we tap into peer-to-peer? We need to think about those threads really radically.
Do you have anything to say? A colleague at the back there, then I'll come to you. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Nick Bent. I'm the co-founder and chief executive of the Tutor Trust. We've been delivering NTP across the north of England for the last 2 years. Worked closely with Susanna and Tom and others in wrestling with the nightmare that has been Randstad over this past academic year, and we fully support the conclusions of this new report as well. I'm keen to hear from the panel, I think particularly from Sam. Now, I mean, what are the chances of the DfE actually implementing some of these solutions? Do you think there's a chance that the DfE might actually impose some sort of target about focusing NTP on disadvantaged pupils for the next 2 years rather than leaving it totally to the discretion of schools?
Well, it would help if we went on our third education section of the week.
Indeed.
I mean, just the hell knows right now, because there's not even a schools minister as far as I know at the moment. And you know, politics is going to go on for a while now, so you know, we're not going to have a permanent Secretary of State till September with a new ministerial team. The likelihood is that they will need to get up to speed with everything. The Prime Minister might appoint a new team of advisors. We've now got months of upheaval. And with the potential of that finishing with people who don't really know anything about this programme and starting from scratch all over again. So I wouldn't have high hopes of good policy decisions being made over the next 6 months. I think the best hope is that whoever ends up with the job when the merry-go-round stops is smart enough to know that they need to listen to expertise and is open to hearing ideas from outside. And you know, I'll certainly be there waving this report if they're interested. But I think the chances of it happening soon are very limited, and I'm worried about the procurement that's now because it is happening essentially in the vacuum.
My understanding is that they're looking at the 2024 spending review and effectively what happens beyond the NTP now, which is why I think this report is very well placed. But even if there was, as I said, someone in charge, given all the upheaval and pain this has caused the government, I think they've probably got to a point where let the next couple of years to play out. Schools will have the money, but their level of accountability, I don't think they'll touch it.
No, I think the biggest thing will be 2024 because it will be when the elections. It will be 2025 in practice.
Yeah, true.
We'll get a 1 year extension.
Colleague,
Hello, it's Sam from Schools. Firstly, I just want to ask whether you think there should be more of a research base in tutoring. So obviously we've got the toolkit now, and the research, you know, it's got today. Should there be more research on tutoring overall and for teachers? If we bring it into schools, and schools have to make the decisions about who becomes a tutor, do that more research. And the other question is about the subsidy that schools receive. So obviously next year is going to be 25%, which is a huge cut. Sorry, not the second year, coming the year after. Moving from 60% to 25%, and that's obviously a huge drop. What is the potential impact?
So observations from the panel, if we can keep them tight, it's one final question to come in.
Research, absolutely. There's too much of a headline that tutoring works and not enough digging into what is it that makes it work. And it's not just that simple at the tutoring. And I think there's so much potential for smaller scale, local schools, particularly with the volume of tutoring going on at the moment. And stuff is happening on whether 1-to-1, 1-to-6, what difference that makes, online, face-to-face. There's so many different variables. And we could be doing these really smart studies at the moment to dig into that and build the evidence base, and not just tutoring as a concept, but actually how to go about making it work well. And funding 25%, I'm terrified of that, because talking to schools certainly for this year, and we were asking for 40%, and it's so many schools in deficit budgets, thinking about redundancies. It's a worrying picture.
I'm interested in Carol, because the NFU, I think, are doing the evaluation of the programme, and I want to know how much have you been able to get into any of these different variables to give us a bit more information about this.
Well, I was actually going to endorse the question. I can't send people out the evaluations.
Oh.
Many people there publish. But the intention of that, that's the both year 1 and year 2, is to evaluate the overall impact on children's progress as a result of how they have tutoring. And what's become increasingly clear to us, given the diversity of approaches, as you say, the mode of delivery, the size of the group, the year group, the subject, there's so many different elements to tutoring that are being implemented at the moment, and we don't know what works. And there's a huge amount of money going into this. And if there are going to be innovative approaches going forward, different approaches, the time is absolutely right to be doing some small-scale randomised controlled trials on different groups of pupils, so that the system as a whole for developing school-level tutors, for providing lessons on good practice for tuition partners, we need to understand more about what mechanism or implementation process works best to make best use of that money.
Thank you. Again, can you write that?
You can see that Carol answered it. I think we just I would just say really tightly into age groups, subjects, types of pupils, who does it work for, and what capacity.
Will that come out of the NPR work and others to get in there?
I think there will be much more to be done during that space.
Thank you. We can hear the bells. I'm going to take up 2 last questions, if that's okay. Colleague here first.
A quick contribution. I'm from Offset. We're also doing a 2-year evaluation of the tutoring program, focusing specifically on the quality of the education and how well the tutoring is linked to the school's curriculum. So our work will also come around at some point.
Thank you. That's good to know. And colleague here first.
It's obviously, I think there's been a massive push on tutoring across the sector, but I think, are we in danger of losing the emphasis with tutoring, particularly around what's happening, and also the fact that tutoring seems to be the one fix that the government is using across the board in FE, as well as school, but also in the new multiplier scheme. There's a big focus in tutoring across the board. Is there a danger of our focus just on tutoring at school level, and actually the government is focusing on tutoring across the board everywhere? And should we have more sort of thinking about how do we get that message across that one, tutoring can work, and we're trying to evaluate not just the school sector, but the wider sector as well.
Brief answer from anyone on the response to that.
At Multiply, we've been looking at this. That would be very interesting to watch. Given some of the comments that Sam's had about people with experience, frankly, about running national programs. So let's focus on those mistakes, or previous mistakes I learned from. There's a lot of evidence around tutoring, so it's clearly a popular policy, as well as a popular policy politically. I understand for the government, so I can see why the government is looking to roll it out. But as we kept saying here, you can't look at that in isolation from how it works in the school and the college and some work there as well. The government has the evidence behind it, the funding is in place across the board, as you say. So I don't think we're going to back from that.
I just want to make a final point on the topic of joined up government. The DfE didn't know about multiply. They weren't involved in this design at all. It was Rishi Sunak who wanted to do it. It was entirely him. They found out that they were doing it, and then suddenly had to come up with a design for something which, if only we could run these things better, we might have a chance of getting some of this joined up.
Well, one positive note to add to that. Having been involved with the EF, Randstad, and now with Multiply, they are far more open to asking questions about how might this work, what do you think, what's your experience, and then adapting to that. And so it's like night and day compared to a year ago with Randstad. So, and I get that impression from across the DfE, so that is a good sign. Positive.
Well, delighted we can extract that. Good note. Yeah. Colleagues, thank you very much indeed for joining this session, and thank you to our colleagues on the panel.